Welcome everyone to a meeting of the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization. I'm David Muller, represent Secretary Jamie Tesler here. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation if you have one. Please do not unmute and mute yourself. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. Find this by clicking either on the participants button at the bottom of the screen and a window will pop up with a raise hand button at the bottom, or the reactions button in the toolbar. The chair will then call on participants. If you're on the phone, you can use @9 to raise your hand. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Rosine Foley via the chat box at rfoley@ctps.org or call her at 857-702-3704. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant, with exceptions, with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards, and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Rosine Foley of the MPO staff at rfoley@ctps.org or call her at 857-702-3704. First item on the agenda is the introductions. John, please call the roll.
Mass. Chair.
Yes, this is David Muller.
Mass. Seat 2.
John Bouchard here.
Mass. Highway Division.
Mascot Highway, John Romano here.
MBTA.
Julian Linnell on behalf of General Manager Poftak.
Massport.
Sarah Lee here.
Thank you. MAPC.
Good morning, Eric Barassa with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
MBTA Advisory Board.
Morning, Brian Kane, MBTA Advisory Board present.
Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Leonard Diggins Advisory Council here.
City of Boston BTD.
Bill Conroy here, representing Mayor Wu.
Thank you. City of Boston BPDA.
Hi, Jim Fitzgerald with the BPDA representing Mayor Wu in the City of Boston.
Thank you. At-large City of Everett.
Jay Monty representing Mayor DeMaria in the City of Everett.
At-large City of Newton.
David Kozas representing Mayor Ruth Ann Fuller in the City of Newton.
At-large Town of Arlington.
Daniel Amstutz, Town of Arlington, representing Select Board Chair Steve DeCourcy and the Town of Arlington.
At-large Town of Brookline.
Heather Hamilton for the Town of Brookline.
Intercore Committee, City of Somerville.
Good morning, Tom Bent, representing Mayor Joe Curtatone and the Intercore Committee.
Thank you. Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, Town of Acton. Okay. Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Eric Johnson representing the City of Framingham here.
Thank you. North Shore Task Force, City of Beverly.
Darlene Nguyen representing the City of Beverly and the North Shore Task Force.
Thank you. North Suburban Planning Council, Town of Burlington.
Melissa Tintopoulos representing Burlington on behalf of Jim Tigas and North Suburban Planning Council.
Thank you. South Shore Coalition, Town of Rockland. Okay. Southwest Advisory Planning Committee, Town of Medway.
Peter Pelletier, Town of Midway.
Thank you. Three Rivers Interlocal Council, Town of Norwood, Neponset River Regional Chamber.
Good morning, Tom O'Rourke from the town of Norwood, representing the Trick subregion.
Thank you. And our ex officio members, Federal Highway Administration
Good morning, Ken Miller, Federal Highway.
and Federal Transit Administration. Okay, that calls the roll, Mr. Chair, although I do believe that Jennifer Constable has just arrived.
Thank you, John. Next item on the agenda is the chair's report. I have two things I'd like to report on today. The first is relating to the Green Line Extension Project. So yesterday I presented to the MBTA Board of Directors, and today I'll be presenting to the MassDOT Board of Directors. MassDOT and the MBTA are recommending that we give Somerville and Cambridge all of their municipal contributions from the Green Line back to them and stop collecting money from them. Basically, the Green Line is coming in under budget for our projections. We've also gotten a slug of money from the American Rescue Plan that is specifically tied to the Green Line. That gives us the comfort to be able to give the cities back their money now. It has been approved by the MBTA board, has not yet been approved by MassDOT board. I will be presenting to them today. Are there questions on that? Seeing and hearing none. Next item is, Tom Bent.
Just real briefly, David, from the city of Somerville, we thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, I was with the mayor last night and he mentioned all that to me, but yeah, we're perfect timing for this.
Thank you, Tom. The second item is, since we last met, the infrastructure bill has passed and been signed into law. So at some point in a future meeting, we will be presenting on all of its impacts and what it means to the MPO and what it means to the state, but we are not ready to present today. Any questions on that? Seeing none, next item on the agenda is the executive director's report. Taken? Oh wait, Brian, I'm sorry, Brian Kane. I still owe you an email answer, Brian, by the way.
Okay, then I won't ask my question. Thank
You
you.
can ask a question. I'm happy to give you the answer now. It saves me from having to write an email.
Ballpark, any sense what we can expect specifically for the MBTA and for cities and towns, and possible amount to flex from highway to transit? Thank you.
So I do not have a ballpark of any of that yet. Yeah, I think, so I'd rather not give a ballpark because we expect real numbers, if not this week, the next.
Okay.
So then we have a more detailed discussion. Ken?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we are receiving information too, and obviously David will obviously let you know when we get it, but they are working through the numbers. It's unlikely that we will need another continuing resolution on December 3rd. But in terms of funding increase for formula funding, which has changed, but it does vary tremendously by funding category. It's not like a straight 30% increase on everything. It varies quite a bit. We will not have the apportionment numbers probably until maybe the beginning of January, but we'll certainly keep everybody informed. And just to let folks know, there is increase in the formula funding, but there are these new discretionary funding categories that still will take some time to work out the regulations and rules around those. But just as a bit of a heads up, there will be some changing eligibilities for existing programs, new and requirements, by the way, changing, and for the new discretionary kinds of programs, there may be new eligibilities in terms of recipients. So for certain kinds of things, MPOs and communities may be able to be direct applicants and recipients of federal funds. So that's just there's a lot of moving parts. I'm sure you know, David, that have to be worked out, but some significant changes on the horizon. And the the law now, just for everybody to know, we're calling it the bipartisan infrastructure law or bill, not the. That's what
Okay.
it is.
I just gotta say, it's been called BIF, the Bistructure Infrastructure Framework, BID, the Bistructure Infrastructure Deal, BIB, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, and now Bill?
But the
It actually has an official name, right? It's got an official name.
Yeah.
All right. All right, so I'll call it Bill when I talk to the feds.
What'd you get out of Bill?
I'm not gonna tell people what I call it Bill when I'm not talking to the feds.
Well, David, they didn't ask my opinion, but yeah, it's the way it is.
Thanks, kid.
Okay.
Jim Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just a couple quick follow-up questions. I think Ken just answered, gave a lot more context, which is helpful as well. But just wondering if it would impact our TIP kind of schedule. And I'm just, I think, confirming it would start with 2023, right? Program year.
So it is supposed to start with 22.
Oh.
Okay. There's a question as to when they pass the appropriations bill, whether they will fund all of 22 or will do some partial funding of 22, but the bill itself is 22 through 26.
Okay,
so both will take effect now. So it will impact, certainly it will impact TIP development for 23 and beyond. There is a question, because we don't yet know what the appropriations bill will say, of how much of an impact it will have on 22 and whether we will have to add projects to 22.
Okay. But would it impact the timing of our TIP decision making, I guess, before we sort it all out was my other question. Hopefully
well,
not.
I don't think so, right? I had sort of said that I expected Federal Highway to give us numbers by the end of next week. Ken, I think just now said it might be January, but even getting numbers in January, getting numbers in January will slow down slightly our giving numbers to the MPOs, because we have work to do on our end before translating federal numbers that the FHWA tells the state we have to translate them to MPO numbers. But I don't think it will slow down TIP development. We don't expect it to anyway.
Okay, thanks.
Ken?
David, you're exactly right. We do need an appropriations bill. And that's, by the way, that's where Congress decides what our obligational authority is. You know, so it's not just apportionments, but then also we need to know what our obligational authority is. Remember, we only get usually a percentage, 95%, 93% of our apportionments that we can spend in any year in terms of obligations. So we do need an appropriations bill, as David said.
Yeah. Any other questions? Seeing none, it's now time for the executive director's report. Take it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. Hello, everyone. We've already gotten started with a little conversation, which is nice. So I'll provide you with a few bits and pieces of information about staff and outreach, and then what's coming up today, as I usually do. So first, I wanted to let you all know that we welcomed another new staff member. His name is Bihao Jin, and he started this month as a model developer working with Marty Milkovich, who some of you heard from this morning at the UPWP committee meeting on the development and implementation of our new travel demand modeling tools. And he won't say hello today, but you can always keep an eye out for him. But he comes to us from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee with a PhD in transportation engineering and a minor in computer science. So if you see Zihao, please welcome him. And we still have a number of ongoing recruitments. No positions are posted at the moment, but we are in the final stages of selecting a manager of outreach and communications. And we have interviews going on for the public outreach coordinator position. That was an existing position. The manager position is new. We also have interviews going on for two kind of existing positions, but we're looking for new folks in those positions. One is a planner analyst position, and another is a planner position that will also take over the UPWP program management, which, as I've mentioned before, will allow Sandy Johnston to take on other responsibilities with the MPO. So keep an eye out for additional postings. We are not stagnating on this, so I'm happy to announce when they come out so you all can send people our way. Outreach highlights. Since the last meeting, we had several virtual coffee chats for the transit working group. We try to keep you updated on those conversations going on. They tend to be small, but we welcome your interest and participation. We've had conversations about regional rail station access. We've had conversations with the regional rail and bus network redesign teams on closing gaps in the transit network, on the shortage of available drivers. And so those are ones that have been going on in November. And then we have one more scheduled right now, which you can find on our Transit Working Group webpage. And that's on preparing and planning for transit recovery from COVID-19 pandemic. And that'll be on December 9th at 1 o'clock. And if you want to be on the mailing list for that, please don't hesitate to reach out to Sandy Johnston. The Community Connections Program, I also wanted to announce, will be releasing project applications for the federal fiscal year 2023 projects or applications in the next week or so. So please keep an eye out for that if you're interested in submitting an application. And then lastly, we are continuing our outreach with the MAPC subregions at their fall meetings. At those meetings, we've been discussing, as I've said before, TIP funding opportunities, UPWP study ideas, technical assistance, and generally speaking, the transportation needs in the subregion that are relevant for the long range plan. So if you are, we still have two more coming up, one for South Shore Coalition on the 18th at 1 o'clock, which is today in the afternoon. And then we have one for the North Suburban Planning Council on December 14th. Please, if you are in those subregions, please join them, please contribute, and please encourage others to join them as well. Then for today, we have two action items. One is to vote on a work scope, which is identifying transportation inequities in the Boston region. And then also we will ask you to vote on the endorsement of the first UPWP amendment. So Betsy Harvey and Sandy Johnston will present on those. And then we'll kick off our discussions around the TIP, which we were just talking about. And for those less familiar, that's the rolling 5-year capital spending plan for the MPO. And today, Matt Genova will talk about the universe of projects and the scores and so from those projects, those are the ones that can potentially be chosen for funding. So Matt Genova will talk to you about that. And then finally, we'll have a presentation by Carolyn Vaness from MassDOT's Office of Transportation Planning on the MBTA's bus network redesign project. And then with that, for the next meeting, which will be on the 2nd of December, just keep an eye out for, there'll be a scope to look at and approve related to travel demand management study. There will also be likely a TIP amendment that you will be asked to look at and vote on. And then we hope to have at least one presentation, which would be on our bike share equity work, and other presentations are still pending. And that is it, Mr. Chair. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Tegan. Melissa, do you have a question?
I do. Regarding the meeting with the North Suburban Planning Council, how do those run and how can I kind of facilitate a better meeting for the MPO on that?
Thank you, Melissa. On that one, I would suggest that you reach out directly to Sandy Johnston and just talk with him a little bit about, wait, I think I just conflated my contacts. I apologize for that. Why don't we connect with you after this meeting? It's at 1 o'clock. Is that the one at 1 o'clock today? I can't recall, I'm sorry. But we can have our staff, our outreach staff connect with you directly today just to chat a little bit about that. So they are run by MAPC. Sandy, you are there. Sorry for calling you out. May I ask if Sandy can respond?
Sure, Sandy, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, so the sub-regional meetings are run by MAPC. We're going to South Shore today, and North Suburban is in December. So we're happy to connect offline, but MAPC has sub-regional coordinators who are responsible for coordinating and running the meetings. So let's connect offline and maybe we can loop Eric Brassa into this conversation as well.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you for stepping up, Sandy.
Any other questions for Tegan? Seeing none, next item on the agenda is public comments. Is there anyone from the public who would like to comment at this time? Seeing and hearing none, if you want to comment during the meeting, please raise your hand and we will call on you. Next item is committee chairs reports. Jay Monty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the Congestion Management Committee will be having a meeting on December 2nd at 9 o'clock before this meeting on that same date. One of the big topics we need to address is really lack of membership on that committee right now. We've had a lot of folks who no longer hold seats on the MPO or very shortly will no longer hold seats on the MPO. And so we do need to fill those spots. I believe we have about 4 spots that need to be filled right now. So you may hear from me personally over the next few days. I'm going to try and do some recruiting, but also please, for any new folks who are new to the MPO and are willing to volunteer their time, we would really appreciate your assistance. So do feel free to reach out to me or any of the folks on the committee and let us know if you're interested.
Thank you, Jay. Any other committee chairs reports at this time? Seeing none, next item on the agenda is the Regional Transportation Advisory Council report. Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so at our last meeting, we had Frank Tremontazzi. He was representing Mayor Koch from the MBTA Advisory Board. He's Mayor Quincy, and he is now representing the MBTA Advisory Board on the Board of Directors for the MBTA. And it is our effort to establish a stronger relationship with the advisory board and the MBTA board of directors. And one thing that Frank told us that was particularly striking to me and important was he related how Mayor Koch had allowed the development of or the creation of the electric bus yard or the bus garage for electric buses in Quincy, and that comes at the hit or Quincy could have essentially raised about $500,000 in revenue on that site, but the mayor felt that it was important for the region to have that bus yard, and I feel that is really a great thing to show the commitment to the region, and I applaud that because I feel that we survive or we die as a region, and we need all of the towns and municipalities to appreciate that, and so that was, I thought, one of the more important elements of the meeting. The second element of the meeting was Ann McGann and Michelle Scott did a kickoff for the LRTP for the advisory board. It was very similar to what took place here, but we did have a jam board, so the members got to add some more input into the kickoff process, and it was beneficial to the group. And lastly, I have been elected to a third term, and it was uncontested, and it makes me very humbled and more. I want to work harder to show that I deserve the confidence that was placed in me, and for some reason I'm a little bit tongue-tied today, but nonetheless, I am thrilled to have the opportunity to continue working with you all. I want to do it, and that's because I really feel that this is a great group of people, and I've said it before, but I'll say it again. When you look around the table, you don't see a whole lot of diversity, but it's not for lack of trying. And also what I've taken from the beginning, before I was even part of this board, when I would just come before the committee to talk about various things that concern me, is how open everyone is to listening to everyone. And it doesn't really matter what side of the table you're on, you're always welcome to the table. And as we'll see later on, this group is really committed to equity. It's not simply a talking point. We work hard at equity, and it's really an honor to be a part of this board. So thank you, and that's it.
Thank you, Lynn, and congratulations. Any questions for Lynn? Seeing none, next item on the agenda is an action item on a work scope identifying transportation equities in the Boston region. Betsy Harvey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everyone. I'm here to request that the MPO approve the UPWP study work program identifying transportation inequities in the Boston region for the federal fiscal year 2023. The study will cost $70,000 and will last about 11 months after work commences. The schedule and cost of each study task can be found in the exhibits at the end of the work program posted on the MPO calendar. The study will begin work to elevate the MPO's equity work to a new level by identifying existing inequities and providing insight into opportunities for reducing inequities that are present in the transportation system today, and not just in the future. The study will develop a baseline assessment of existing transportation equities in the Boston region for environmental justice, or EJ, populations, which include minority and low-income populations. Now, existing MPO policies related to equity align with federal civil rights and EJ requirements that focus on preventing future discrimination. This study will further the MPO's commitment to equity by seeking to quantify existing inequities among EJ populations when compared to non-EJ populations that have resulted from past investments. Task 1 will consist of a review of the state of the current practice to help identify metrics that will be analyzed as baseline equity indicators, the development of a preliminary list of metrics, and a presentation of this list to the MPO board for additional input and feedback prior to beginning conducting the analyses. We will also meet with EJ advocacy groups prior to finalizing the metrics to get their input into metrics that we may be missing and insight into possible methodological approaches. Finally, we'll coordinate with staff at MassDOT, MAPC, and the MBTA to ensure that this study does not duplicate the work done by these agencies and that it can support their work where practical. Now, at a minimum, we expect these metrics will include those that will be analyzed for the MPO's disparate impact and disproportionate burden analysis in the long-range plan Destination 2050. These will include travel time metrics for both public transit and driving modes, access to various opportunities such as healthcare and jobs for both public transit and driving modes again, as well as exposure to carbon monoxide. We'll also examine transportation costs for environmental justice communities, which was originally proposed as a separate UPWP study, but later integrated into this one. Because this work is new to the MPO and we will be developing the methodology as part of the study, it's not certain whether we'll have the capacity to analyze additional metrics beyond the ones I mentioned. As part of the presentation to the MPO of the preliminary list of metrics at the conclusion of task 1, we'll discuss possible additional metrics that we may analyze if resources and time allow. Now in task 2, we will analyze metrics chosen in task 1 for existing inequities between EJ populations and their non-EJ counterparts. As I mentioned, these are novel analyses for the MPO, and it's anticipated that the development of the methodologies for analyzing these metrics will be an iterative process. Therefore, a large portion of the work will be devoted to developing and documenting replicable methodologies and producing results that are useful to the MPO and its transportation equity program. I should also note that it's unlikely we'll be using our travel demand modeling tools for these analyses, even though you may recall that we do use them to analyze the disparate impact and disproportionate metrics in the long-range transportation plan. For the study, we intend to use lighter weight tools, including, for the first time at CTBS as part of the study, Conveil, which is a destination access tool that we've recently acquired at CTBS. And then in task 3, we will create a brief report documenting the purpose of the study, the metric selection analysis methodology, and results. The report will also include recommendations for additional research, recommendations for updating metrics on a regular basis, and a discussion of how the outcomes of the study can be used to support other MPO programs. And finally, in task 4, we'll present those findings to the MPO. Now, because this study overlaps with several areas of the MPO's work, we will coordinate with managers of the long-range transportation plan, performance-based planning and programming, and the transportation improvement program to prevent duplication of work and identify ways that this study can support those programs. So that wraps up my overview of the study, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Betsy. Questions? Lynn Diggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm excited about this, Betsy, and it seems as if you have a lot to build on. And speaking of duplication, I remember being a part of the work to develop the DBI policy, and I recall a focus or one of our early meetings where me and a bunch of us did lay out some metrics or some potential metrics. I assume that's going to be included as a foundation for this.
Are you referring that second meeting where we kind of brainstormed a bunch of lists of metrics?
Yeah.
Those, we will definitely refer to those as part of our kind of thinking about which metrics we want to include as part of the study. And whether or not we'll be able to analyze all of them does depend a bit on how quickly the development of the methodology goes, because this is a new process, methodologically speaking, for us. And that's why we want to make sure we share kind of which metrics we do want to analyze with you. And then kind of ones that we can't, we kind of put this aside and say, hey, maybe we want to do this, look at these metrics as part of another study or in a different program. So, but yes, we will definitely be referring back to that list that we worked on during that process.
Great. And one additional question, and that is, do you imagine this work contributing to the scores for TIP projects?
No, not this year. We don't have any methodology for any of the evaluation criteria that uses Conveil or any of the other in terms of analyzing access to opportunities or any of the other metrics that we probably will analyze as part of the study. But that being said, I think that this is a really great opportunity for us to kind of see how we can use a tool like Conveil and other metrics, and how much time it takes and how much effort, and if it's a reasonable thing to in the future incorporate into our TIP evaluation criteria, but it wouldn't be like an immediate application.
Right, not immediate, but I guess at that point then, because I was expecting you to say that, yes, not this year, but eventually. So then I guess I'm a little confused as to where we would apply what we learned, because you said it's not going to be included in modeling for the LRTP, and if it's not going to potentially be used for scoring projects for the TIP, then where are we going to use what we learned?
I think it could be used eventually for scoring. I guess what I'm saying is that wouldn't expect, we'd have to revise the TIP scoring criteria in order to use this, but what we learned from this study can definitely be used if the MPO chooses to kind of go that route or use these metrics in future iterations of TIP scoring. We could definitely do that. And just more generally, we don't have a good sense of kind of baseline inequities regarding transportation in our region. I mean, ABC has done some work, MBTA has done work, and so has MassDOT, and so this is more of an effort to set kind of an initial baseline of where are we today to help the MPO make decisions about what TIP criteria should we kind of use in the future, or how should we focus our investments, or what goals should we set as in the LRTP. And in addition, regarding the LRTP, this will also definitely help support the needs assessment. So we won't be overlapping with needs assessment, but definitely the information that we get from this study will be documented as well in our needs assessment for the next long range plan.
I get it. It's more of a step one. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Brian Kane.
Thanks, David. And just to follow up, first of all, Betsy, this is clearly something we should be doing, and I do support it. I just wanted to follow up on a little bit of what Len said. Is it's always a pleasure to follow the poet laureate of transportation in Eastern Massachusetts. I don't think any of us want to do a study for study's sake. So I'm hoping you can help me understand how this might be integratable into things like the Title VI study that T does from time to time, the disparate impact studies that T does from time to time. help me understand how this dovetails with other work that's going on in this space, because I think none of us want to duplicate things that are going on, and clearly you don't either. But I think we all agree that something like this needs to happen. I just want to make sure that this is the right approach. Thank you.
Yes, definitely. Thanks, Brian. I think what this does is to kind of set the groundwork, because a lot of our work with disparate impact, which you brought up, whether it's the T or MassDOT or MB or us, MPO, it's looking into the future, right? We're saying in 2050, we don't want environmental justice populations to be disproportionately affected or adversely affected, whether it's by air quality or lack of access to destinations. But we don't have a great sense of today, like a comprehensive understanding of in our region, where are the disparities? And it's great to want to prevent disparities in the future, but I think that what we also want to do is be identifying and preventing and addressing existing disparities. And so I think by having that information, in a way, perhaps it is a little bit of study for study's sake, but it's giving you information about what disparities are present and information about how to then program projects and what criteria should we be setting different criteria for equity potentially to address these existing disparities, or in our long range plan, do we need to program certain projects in a way that helps address these existing disparities? And so I look at it as a kind of on the ground, what can we do now in a more immediate term, rather than focusing solely on preventing discrimination in the future. Let's try to address the existing disparities, and hopefully this will be useful information too for the T. So we're certainly looking at metrics related to transit, and so there may be a broader suite of metrics than they usually look at. As well, same with MassDOT, and so we don't want to duplicate what they're doing. We want to add to the conversation, and so may include metrics that kind of may help folks in the BTA think through some of the other challenges that people are facing, but they may not already be looking at.
I guess I would just encourage you to, through OTP, talk to partners in the rest of state government that are doing similar work in the housing space and economic development space. I guess I would push back a little bit by saying we don't know where the EJ communities are now, or the folks are now. I think certainly there's been a lot of self-identification, at least on the T side of where EJ communities are and what they want. So again, I'm going to support this. I think it's great. I'm glad we're doing it. Just want to encourage everyone to be as broad-based as possible and not duplicative. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Brian.
Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Betsy, I have a question about, do you envision moving forward making any distinction between an urban versus a suburban setting in terms of selecting metrics? Or because, for example, if I'm in an urban environment, I have presumably better access to transit, whereas in a suburban environment, if I don't, where there's less access to transit, but also if I don't own or have access to a private vehicle, the travel times are not even relevant because I don't have access. And by private vehicle, you can have access, you can own it, or there are the Uber or Lyft, those kinds of things, but obviously pretty pricey. So I was just curious if you're making any distinction between urban and suburban environments.
Not geographically speaking, we'll be looking at geographically the entire region. So looking at communities of color and low-income communities kind of as a whole throughout the region. So we won't be separating out urban versus suburban, but we are going to be looking at access, and that's going to be a really big part of this study. And I think that's really where transportation, we're talking about analyzing transportation equity, that's where the field is, and we're really focused on that, on access and what that means. And so travel times less, I think, are really kind of less important. Like you said, they really do depend in part on the availability of transportation in the first place. And so I think I'm hoping, I think that access, to analyze and access different destinations will help, will kind of take into that consideration, right, of the availability of different types of transportation for different population groups.
And just as a follow-up, are you only looking at EJ communities or because there are lower income and minorities and all over, but not just in EJ communities?
Absolutely. So what we're going to do is we're not going to look at we're not going to do like a block group and say does it have a certain percentage of EJ community or EJ population or not. We're looking at where the actual people are, right? And so that will make it easier to, so that will allow us to kind of make sure we're identifying people who are living, lower income communities that aren't necessarily in the urban core, because you're absolutely right there, people live all over the region. And so we really want to make sure that we're not just kind of classifying geographies as either environmental justice or not environmental justice, and really trying to get at where people are actually living and using that information to analyze accessibility and other metrics.
Right, thank you very much.
Any other questions? Seeing none, can I get a motion in a second to approve this today? Lynn Diggins.
I'd like to make a motion to approve this work scope. Certainly, the more Betsy talked and answered questions, explained things, the more supportive I am of it. Thank you.
Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa, I second that motion.
Jonathan, please call the roll.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Jillian Linnell,
Jillian Linnell, yes.
Sarah Lee,
Sarah Lee, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Bill Conroy,
Bill Conroy, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Jim Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Hey, Monty, yes.
David Kozas,
David Kozas, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Benton, yes.
Eric Johnson,
Eric Johnson, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
Melissa Tentakoulis,
Melissa Tentakoulis, yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jen-
I'm sorry, was that a yes?
Jen-
Thank you. Peter Pelletier
Peter Pelletier, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries unanimous, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next item on the agenda is an action item on the federal fiscal year 2022 UPWP Amendment number 1.
Good morning. I am here to ask for your endorsement of amendment number 1 to the current federal fiscal year 2022 UPWP. The UPWP committee met this morning to discuss this amendment and voted to recommend that the MPO endorse it. You voted to release this amendment for a 21-day public comment period on October 21st. That public comment period ran through November 10th. We received no public comments on this amendment. Just going to recap the details of the amendment briefly. The amendment extends $45,000 in unused FFY 2021 combined 3C planning funds for two major purposes related to the MPOs and CTPS's strategic goals. There are $20,000 that will be used for new skill development for staff early in fiscal year 22, with a focus on preparing staff to implement a new suite of modeling tools. There's a light load of non-MPO funded project work at the beginning of this fiscal year that's creating staff availability and presenting an opportunity to immediately and efficiently use these remaining 21 funds without affecting the use of 22 funds. There's also $25,000 that will be transferred from labor and overhead to direct costs. These funds will be used to procure support from Caliper, which is the developer of the travel demand software TransCAD that we use. Caliper's support provides a one-time opportunity to accelerate the development of the next phase of travel demand modeling tools. So overall, the amendment increases the federal fiscal year 2022 UPWP budget by $45,000. Because the funds being used are extended FFY 2021 funds, there's no negative impact to work previously programmed in the fiscal year 22 UPWP. The amendment also makes several minor typo corrections and textual corrections. There are several accompanying materials to help explain the amendment, and these are currently posted to the MPO meeting calendar. There's a short memo explaining the process and reasoning and need behind the amendment, which includes a table summarizing the changes that we're asking to make. There's also an updated version of the 22 UPWP as it would be if this amendment is endorsed, and a redlined marked up version of the FFY 22 UPWP showing where changes have been made. I'm happy to take any questions you may have. If you're satisfied, we request that you endorse this amendment, after which it will be reviewed by our federal partners.
Thank you, Sandy. Any questions for Sandy? Seeing none, can I get a motion in a second to approve this as presented today? And please state your name for the record. Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa, make a motion to approve the federal fiscal year 2022 UPWP Amendment 1.
Tom Bent.
I would like to second that motion.
Thank you. Jonathan, motion has been made and seconded. Please call the roll.
David Muller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
I think you had to step away to chair another meeting, Jonathan. Just go on.
okay. Jillian Linnell,
Jillian Linnell, yes.
Sarah Lee,
Sarah Lee, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Amira Patterson,
Mayor Patterson, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Bill Conroy,
Bill Conroy, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Jim Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Eric Johnson,
Eric Johnson, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
Melissa Tintakis,
Yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
Peter Pelletier,
Peter Pelletier, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next item on the agenda is the FFY 2023 to 2027 TIP Project Universe. Matt Genova.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everyone. I'm here today to present the project universe for the federal fiscal years 2023 through 2027 Transportation Improvement Program. Here's the ground that I'll cover in this presentation. Start with an overview of this year's TIP development timeline, and then we'll review the key decisions made by this board during last year's TIP development process. I'll talk a little bit about the project development process and then provide a high-level summary of the TIP universe. I'll conclude by going over a handful of next steps before opening things up for questions and comments at the end. I also want to note that the TIP universe is posted to the MPO meeting calendar under today's date. In that document, you'll notice a second table that includes information on the MPO funded projects that are programmed in the current TIP. That's the fiscal years 2022 through 26 TIP. There's also a third table there that lists MPO funded projects that were advertised in the last federal fiscal year, and a fourth table showing which projects were removed from the project universe since last year. Especially those third and fourth tables, but really the second through fourth tables are really just there for your reference, as that's information that staff have been asked for in the past, and so we wanted to go ahead and provide that for you upfront this year. So I want to start by giving you all a sense for what the TIP development timeline will look like in the coming months. This is a timeline of the TIP development process. The timeline is generally similar to years past, but it may change over the next few months depending on any adjustments that are made to the MPO meeting schedule. And as we discussed at the outset of this meeting, there still is some uncertainty around what this year looks like with respect to the new bipartisan infrastructure law, the bill. And so that could also affect the TIP development timeline a little bit as well. And so these dates are really tentative and sort of our best estimation of how the process will go at this point. In bold is where we are today. As you can see, we'll continue to gather information on prospective TIP projects over the next few weeks before beginning the project scoring process in earnest in mid to late December. I want to go into a little bit more detail on this timeline for a quick refresher on how the process will unfold in the coming months. The TIP process really kicks off with the start of the federal fiscal year on October 1st. Since then, we've been in touch with all 97 cities and towns in the region to confirm a main point of contact for the TIP process. We've also hosted a handful of general information sessions on the TIP process and have hosted several one-on-one conversations with municipalities and transit operators in the region to discuss specific projects and answer questions about the TIP. Throughout October and November, we've also been collecting data on projects that are in the pipeline to be scored this year, a process that will continue until mid-December. December 17th is the deadline to submit new applications for funding this year. Project evaluations will begin at that time and carry through mid-January, at which point we'll send the draft scores to project proponents for their review. And that review process is really a critical component of the overall TIP development, as we really want to make sure that we score every project accurately and that all proponents understand their scores and feel like they represent their projects correctly. In February, MassDOT typically hosts TIP readiness days where cost and readiness updates are provided on all currently programmed projects. These updates will be shared with you all in early March, officially kicking off a series of conversations on new project programming. In February, we'll also present final project scores to this board. Throughout March, we'll consider different programming scenarios, arriving at a final draft list of projects by the end of the month or early April. And that draft list will be incorporated into the full TIP report, which we anticipate releasing for public comment in late April. After a 21-day public comment period, we'll bring all feedback on the TIP back to this board for your consideration before taking a final vote on the 2023 through 27 TIP in late May. So since it's been several months and much has happened since last spring, I do want to provide a quick reminder of the key decisions that were made through last year's TIP development. First, this board elected to fund 10 new projects last year, all of which were funded through the MPO's first and last mile community connections program. Though last year's TIP development formally covered fiscal years 2022 through 26, there was some funding left over in fiscal 2021. This board opted to allocate that $14 million to phase 2 of the MBTA's center running bus lane project on Columbus Avenue in Boston. For those who have been following that project closely, you'll know that phase 1 of that project just opened in recent days. Many of you will likely remember that one of the major themes from last year, as has been the case for the last couple of years, was cost overruns for already programmed projects. These cost changes severely limited this board's ability to consider funding for new projects, which is why the slate of projects funded last year isn't more robust. To that end, $77 million in new funding last year was allocated to projects that were already programmed in the previous TIP. So in response to that, as we've discussed at length throughout the fall, this board created a committee to discuss policy changes to address project cost increases. The committee's work wrapped up at the last MPO meeting on November 4th, with this board's endorsement of a new policy framework. The framework is now in effect for this TIP cycle, and in many ways that cycle is kicking off formally today with this presentation. Sorry about that. So again, all 10 projects that received new funding last year were advanced through the MPO's Community Connections program. Last year's TIP cycle was the second funding round for this program. I won't list all of these projects in detail or go through them at length, but the funded projects are 2 expansions of the Blue Bike system, including new stations in Medford, Malden, Arlington, Newton, and Watertown. We also funded 2 bicycle parking projects in Wellesley and across the MBTA system. 2 new shuttle services were funded in Newton and in Canton, and then 4 other projects, including transit signal priority in Malden and Everett, a transit app education program in Brookline, a parking management system in Acton, and wayfinding improvements at Alewife Station were all funded during last year's TIP development process. Collectively, these projects fully utilized the Community Connections program program's $2 million in available funding in federal fiscal year 2022, and also included are some allocations of future funding in fiscal 2023 and 2024 to each of those shuttle projects that operate over multiple federal fiscal years. So before we dive into the universe, I do want to talk a little bit about the TIP project development process to clarify how projects arrive at this stage in the conversation. So this is the overall TIP development process from project ideation all the way through to construction. So I'm not going to go into detail on the whole thing, but I do want to walk through the first several steps here. So every project that wants to be considered for TIP funding through the MPO really starts with twin conversations between a project proponent and both MassDOT Highway District staff and MPO staff. We encourage all proponents to reach out to both us and MassDOT staff early to discuss preliminary design ideas and confirm that the project in question is a good fit for seeking federal funding and that it aligns with the MPO's funding priorities. Assuming a project is a good candidate for the TIP, project proponents will then fill out a project need form outlining the basic reasoning for why the project is being pursued. This process takes place through MapIt, which is MassDOT's online project intake tool. MassDOT Highway staff review this project need form and then approve it, and then the proponent will proceed to fill out a project initiation form. This form goes into a little bit more detail about how the project will address the needs that are outlined in that first project need form. Once both of these forms are completed, the project can then be approved by MassDOT's project review committee. This is a necessary step before projects can be formally scored by MPO staff for TIP funding. Once PRC approval is complete, a project is assigned a project number and a MassDOT project manager who will continue to work with the proponent to move the project forward. From there, the project can enter the universe of projects and be actively considered for funding in the TIP. All of the projects that have completed these steps will have a project number, cost estimate, and project status all listed in the project universe that we have posted online. So when you're looking at the TIP universe, however, you'll also notice that some projects lack these elements. And these are typically projects that are gathered by MPO staff through direct municipal outreach. And that's a topic that I'll come back to here in just a second. So with all of that background in mind, I'll dive now into the project universe for this year's TIP cycle. To create the universe, we began with last year's project universe and then removed any programmed or deactivated projects. Again, those projects that are no longer active are listed in table 4 in the posting for today's meeting. So we then added to and refined that list from municipal TIP contacts, input from municipal TIP contacts rather, as well as input from MassDOT Highway District staff. We've also attended several virtual meetings with MAPC sub-regional groups, which you heard a little bit about again at the outset of this meeting. And at those sub-regional meetings, new projects and needs are often discussed. And then if those needs are sort of at the project specific level, those projects then show up in the TIP universe. And again, those are some of those projects that are listed as pre-PRC in the design status column. So these are projects that may not, or really will not be ready for consideration for TIP funding in this TIP cycle, but that are sort of on our radar in future years as municipalities work to sort of, really refine those project concepts and then begin the project initiation process with MassDOT. So turning now to a little bit more information on this year's universe, which again is posted to the MPO meeting calendar under today's date. So table 1 in that handout is the project universe, and that represents the full list of projects that are currently on our radar to potentially evaluate for funding either in this TIP cycle or in a future TIP cycle. The universe is broken down by MAPC subregion and then further divided by project type, allowing you to see the proposed complete streets, intersection improvements, bicycle and pedestrian, and major infrastructure projects in each subregion. There's also a key at the top of the table. So projects that were evaluated last year for funding but not funded are highlighted in green, while projects that are in the universe for the first time this year are highlighted in orange. Projects that have no highlighting were in the universe last year and remain so this year. These projects across all 3 of those categories are at varying stages of design, which you'll see noted in the design status column. So similar to the breakdown of projects in the current TIP, you can see that more than half of the projects in the project universe are complete streets. There are also 21 intersection improvement projects and 14 bicycle and pedestrian projects in the universe, along with 12 major infrastructure projects, 3 of which are currently programmed in the MPO's long-range transportation plan. Across subregions, you can see that there is quite a bit of variability in the number of projects that are included in the universe. Much of this variation comes from how many ideas each municipality brings to the fall MAPC subregional meetings. As I mentioned earlier, this is one of the key ways that MPO staff source new projects for funding in future years. Also note here that we do have upcoming meetings that we touched on this earlier in the meeting, but we have not yet met this fall with either the North Suburban Planning Council or the South Shore Coalition. So depending on the type of feedback that we get at those 2 meetings, more projects could be added to the project universe in each of those subregions. So there are nearly 100 projects in the universe, and I'm not going to go into details on a project by project level, but of course, if you do have questions on any specific projects, I'll be happy to try to answer those at the end of my presentation. I want to sort of describe the universe in a couple of different ways to help put this project list in context. And one of the questions that's come up in prior discussions that we've had on the project universe is how our current universe compares to past universes. So shown here are the last 6 TIP project universes. As you can see, the total number of projects in any given year has fluctuated between 100 on the high end and just under 70 on the low end. Over the last 2 years or so, MassDOT has made a significant effort to deactivate projects that were initiated several years ago and that are no longer active priorities. So this brought the overall number of projects down a little bit on average in the middle years of this chart. There aren't radical differences in the contents of the TIP universe year to year, though the number of prospective projects in any given investment program does fluctuate somewhat based on how many new projects enter the pipeline and how many existing projects are funded. You'll notice that the trend over the last 2 years has been generally upward, in large part because very few new projects have been funded by the MPO over the last 2 TIP cycles due to cost increase issues for existing projects. Again, a topic that we've covered at length. I would like to note that the universe is very much a working document that continues to evolve throughout the year as new projects are initiated and other projects are funded. So what you see here today is really a snapshot in time of what's on our radar for TIP programming today. Again, some projects are not yet approved by MassDOT's Project Review Committee, and so those projects will not be eligible for scoring this year. We'll only score a subset of projects on the list, and those are projects that are PRC approved and that are active priorities to move forward. That scoring list will definitely include the 14 projects that we scored last year, but were unable to fund due to financial limitations. You may also notice that there aren't any community connections projects on the list. Those projects are sourced through an open call application process rather than the more formal TIP project initiation process that I just discussed earlier, and that happens in partnership with MassDOT. So because that application is opening in all likelihood by today or tomorrow, we will begin to source those community connections projects, and those will be brought to this board for consideration alongside the rest of the TIP projects once they are scored later this winter. So speaking of project scoring, one question that came up last year was how the number of projects scored compares across each fiscal year. So as you can see on the slide here, the number of traditional TIP projects, those are complete streets, intersection improvements, bicycle and pedestrian projects, etc. The number of projects there has actually ticked downward in each year over the last 5 TIP cycles. This is primarily due to the fact that we've become a little bit pickier in which projects we score. So beginning with the 21 through 25 TIP cycle, MPO staff made an effort to remove projects from the scoring process that were no longer active municipal priorities. This allows the scoring conversations that we have in the spring to be more focused on projects that are actually in a place to move forward through the TIP process in the near term. And beginning in the 21 through 25 TIP cycle, we also started scoring projects through the MPO's Community Connections Program, which has added to the overall number of projects in the scoring mix. And you can see in those orange bars here on the right-hand side of this graph depicts those projects broken out from the other TIP projects in the scoring process. As we wrap up, I do want to touch briefly on the implications of the new TIP project cost policies for this year's TIP project scoring process. As a reminder, this body elected to move forward with a requirement that projects submit 25% design plans to MassDOT prior to being funded in the TIP. Throughout the community's conversations, there was some concern that this could impact the number of projects that are ready to be funded in this coming TIP cycle. Right now, 7 of the 14 projects that we anticipate scoring this year have reached that 25% submission threshold, meaning that there are at least several projects that this board could choose from that align with that new policy goal. That being said, I do want to emphasize that all project funding decisions are ultimately at the discretion of this board. The committee, in developing policy over the last several months, repeatedly stated its desire that these new policies maintain some degree of flexibility, especially as they're rolled out in year 1. That means that this board is still welcome to select projects for funding that have not quite reached the 25% design submission threshold. And this is a topic that we'll certainly come back to in future conversations as we discuss project programming later this winter. But because these policies are new, I wanted to at least touch on them here to ensure that we are sort of moving forward on the same page. Speaking of moving forward, where are we going from here? Over the next few weeks, we'll continue to talk with municipalities and gather project information on those projects that want to be considered for funding this year. Again, the deadline to submit information on any new projects this year is coming up on December 17th. And then from there, we'll begin project scoring, which we anticipate will continue until roughly the 3rd week in January. At that point, project proponents will be able to review their scores and provide feedback before the final scores are presented to this board in February. So that gives you a sense of where we're heading. And with that, I will turn it over to the chair for questions and a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Questions for Matt? Lynn Diggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we're at the beginning of the process again, and I just want to focus on municipalities, and their engagement. At this point, I really appreciate the extent to which the staff conducts the sub-region meetings. Do you get a sense that there are communities that want to do things but can't because they don't have the either the financial resources or the staff resources to propose a project?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, a common refrain that we hear, especially at, sub-regional meetings in partnership with MAPC is that, municipal staff have a lot on their plates. And so often, projects are expressed as, this is a project that we've been talking about at the municipal level. We're not sure of a timeline for moving it forward, but it's something that we'd like to see advance in the next year, the next 2 years. And so, I'll say, I think that's often sort of how it's framed. It's just that, projects are certainly priorities and there is a desire at the municipal level to move them forward. But, due to sort of other ongoing work at any given municipal level, or, questions about funding project design and, overall town budgeting, we do hear a lot of those concerns. But, ultimately, I mean, that's why we really want to focus on getting those project ideas on paper to sort of help municipalities say like, okay, you've expressed this need for us. It's concrete enough to say that, there's a specific geography and a specific need. Now that it's on our radar, we can continue to sort of have that conversation with you, follow up with you, and see if there's other support we can provide to help you advance the project. But I think, this sort of universe development process and getting those projects on paper as, concrete ideas, I think is a first step in allowing us at the MPO staff level to be a resource to help municipalities move things forward.
Great, thank you.
Other questions? Seeing none. Thank you, Matt.
So thank you, everyone.
What's the next item on the agenda, John? Next item on the agenda is the MBTA's bus network redesign. Carolyn Vaness.
David, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Thanks, David. And good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me this morning. I'm really excited to present on kind of the latest with the bus network redesign. I know some folks have seen pieces of this presentation, so apologies for repeating things. Hoping to kind of get through this fairly quickly to maximize time for discussion and kind of what's coming up on the project. And I'm also joined today by my colleagues at the T, Wes Edwards and Melissa DeLay, so they can kind of help fill in for some of the questions that come up for the discussion. So I am Caroline Vaness. I work in the Office of Transportation Planning, and I am leading the bus network redesign. So next slide, please. Thank you. So before I start, I always like to use this slide to just talk about how there's many different projects going on at the T right now to improve the bus experience. There are things to improve transit priority, or rather implement transit priority to get buses through congestion. There are bus stop improvements, improvements to modernize our fleet and facilities, improve passenger information and bus operations. Next slide, please. And bus network redesign is really focused on service and really matching service to the new travel needs of the region to create a better experience for current and future bus riders. Next slide. So we're redesigning, as I said, to create a better network for our riders. A network redesign, when I use that term, I'm talking about a network that generally serves the same neighborhoods and streets, but connects them in different ways to make a network that's better for our riders overall. Next slide. And I just want to talk for a few minutes about our commitments. So first and foremost, equity is really guiding this process. And when I say equity, I specifically mean improving access to destinations and opportunities and quality of service for our transit critical populations. Those are defined as low income populations, people of color, seniors, people with disabilities, or people who live in households with few or no vehicles. We're also talking about truly transformational change. So this is a project where you will largely see change across the network, not just a few kind of nitpicking small changes on a few specific routes, but you will see an entirely new network as a result of this project. We're also talking about a better network for people who ride today. We did a lot of outreach through the Better Bus Project in 2018 and 19, and we heard from riders about what they want to see for the bus network, and we really want to deliver on that. We're also committed to extensive stakeholder engagement. We actually recently just wrapped up a lot of municipal conversations with a bunch of folks who are on this call today, and we plan to continue to do that, as well as continue to engage with our riders. We also just wrapped up 60 hours of street teams at different bus stops and stations to really talk to riders and inform them about this project. We are also committed to implementation in the near term. So this is not a long-range planning process. This is a process that is planning for implementation starting in 2022 in phases over 5 years. And I'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of the presentation. And then finally, we are really looking to integrate service changes with bus priority and other capital investments in order to really maximize benefits to our riders. Next slide. So we're not just restoring, we're transforming. We believe that going back to the pre-COVID network is not good enough. We want to build a better and more equitable network than we had before. And we know that transit is essential to the economic recovery of the region. While the redesign is based on pre-COVID service hours, we are working on a plan where we can show where we'd want to add more service if we get additional resources. And all of this overall to just say that the network should really change to reflect the changing travel needs of the region. Next slide. So we're redesigning the entire network, and we use the term, a blank slate redesign to really emphasize that, imagine if you were to just rebuild the bus network, what would it look like? That is what we are trying to do. And this is both a data-driven and people-driven process. So it starts with everything we've already heard from riders since the Better Bus Project started. Also close coordination with our municipal and agency partners to really create a shared vision for the region, because working with all of you is really what's going to actually allow us to implement this vision. And then also importantly, understanding all the trips people are taking. So transit generally has been focused historically on serving 9 to 5 commute trips. And we really want to understand how transit can serve not just those types of trips, but really all different trip types in the region to create a better bus network. Next slide. And we've really, as I said, spent a lot of time doing outreach on this, and we plan to continue to do that through the next 6 months. But these are kind of just some of the major themes that we've heard from our riders. Riders want the bus network to go where they need to go when they need it. They want a bus network that's fast, frequent, and reliable, that's simple and easy to use, and that serves the people who need it most. Next slide. And I just wanted to mention real quick some of the new data sets that we're using to inform this process. And kind of most importantly, we're using new location-based services data, or cell phone service, to really understand where people are traveling, even if they're not currently using the MBTA to get there. So this data is really great because it describes trips on all modes. So you're able to capture trips even if people are traveling by car, walking, or biking. It also represents all trip types, so not just work, but also social, medical, grocery store trips, etc. It's anonymized and unlinked to preserve privacy. And we also completed a survey over the summer to help supplement this data and actually hear from riders directly on, if this data kind of got it right. Next slide. And kind of what's really exciting about this data set is it's really the best data we've ever had on how low-income residents and people of color travel. And it's really allowed us to prioritize trips made by these populations when we're thinking about where we want to allocate resources and design new service. Next slide. And just in terms of like how we're planning to evaluate this and what success kind of looks like. So there's like 3 kind of guiding questions here. And one is just like, is the MBTA providing transit critical populations with equitable transit service? As I said, equity is really a driving force to see if we have succeeded in redesigning the network. And then kind of related to that, we want to understand, is the MBTA actually connecting people to the places that they want to get to? And then is the MBTA a good option for getting them there? And is it a competitive option with car-based options? Next slide. Okay, so in order to actually achieve all of these things, there are some trade-offs that I wanted to talk about, and just some of the kind of current constraints that we're up against. Next slide. So making the network better will require change, and we want people to get comfortable with this idea because change is always hard. So these are just some of the kind of service design pieces that I wanted to talk about. So service first will be focused where there is a lot of demand for travel, and especially where transit critical populations travel. There may be fewer stops along some routes. Bus routes will be straighter and more direct. Routes will be simplified so that they can run the same way all day. Schedules will be better aligned with all-day demand. Some areas may see new types of service. There may be fewer routes on some streets, and passengers may need to transfer to another bus or to the rail system. Now, none of these things are necessarily bad, but they do require change, and they would be different than how the current system operates in some ways. So just wanting to highlight that. Next slide. And one of the major pieces that we are focusing on that will bring a really large benefit to our bus riders is creating more what we're calling high frequency corridors. So currently on our bus network, we have our current kind of key bus routes, and we want to expand upon that because we know that frequency, it really allows people to utilize the bus network in a better way to access opportunities to more different trip types. And so the way we're thinking about this, and we've actually, as I mentioned, talked to a lot of you about this already, is this idea that, we want to identify and create these high frequency corridors that have frequent service, but also have the improved infrastructure around them. So we can really guarantee that we can provide kind of frequent and reliable service that gets people through congestion to where they need to go. So this service would be all day with the associated bus infrastructure. It would have minimum frequency and minimum span of service. And what we're really looking at is like similar to our current KBR service in terms of the service hours, but with more weekend service as we see a need to better provide service for those trip types. And then, as I said, we'd have the associated infrastructure working with you all to implement some sort of transit priority treatments along these corridors, as well as improvements to our bus stop amenities. And these corridors would be presented to the public through, distinct route nomenclature that really shows up distinctively on the network map. Next slide. And one of the reasons we're focusing on this so much is because if you look at our current map of our current key bus routes, you see that there's definitely some places that are missing having this high frequency service, especially north of Boston. We see a need to provide more service there, more high frequency service, and also a need to provide kind of this more like crosstown connections versus just bringing people directly into downtown Boston. Next slide. And so I'll just talk for a few minutes. I'm going to go through these slides relatively quickly just so we make sure to get to the discussion portion, but just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about some of the limits that we are taking into consideration for this project. So, there is a limit to how much service the MBTA can provide because resources are limited and trade-offs will be necessary. So there's only so much money available to pay for operations. The MBTA also has so many buses, which limits the amount of service that can run during peak periods. The MBTA has only so much space in their garages to hold more buses. And the MBTA also has only so many bus drivers who can each only work a portion of the day. And so the redesign is really looking at what can be done within existing resources. But as I said, we'll also identify where additional resources could be used to improve service most effectively, and also working with the teams in different departments who are working on expanding the fleet and facilities and how this can integrate with those plans. Next slide. We also know that not all of our streets are actually busable. So if you look at, just the different street networks that different transit agencies have, they have more grid-like streets than Boston does. You can just kind of see that here. Next slide. We also know that curb space limits our ability to provide service. So, lots of people want to go to the same places at the same time every day, but there are limits to the number of bus routes that can end at the same place. And some of that is related to, there needs to be a space for the bus to park, and we really need like layover space. And that'll be a really important thing that we work with all of our municipal partners to figure out where we will need new layover space to run some of these new routes. And there's only limited safe space for buses to lay over in most areas, especially in crowded areas like places like the LMA, Harvard Square downtown. And as I said, expanding layover space will be really important to implementing bus network redesign. Next slide. We also know that roadway congestion limits our ability to provide service. And so dedicated bus lanes or other forms of transit priority will really help provide better service that's faster and more reliable. Next slide. And we know that congestion increases our operating costs, so we can, buy more buses, but ultimately if we don't have transit priority in our most congested places, you end up kind of, it ends up being more expensive to really provide the levels of service that we want to provide. Next slide. And we know we can address those kinds of limitations through partnerships, and we've had many success with a lot of folks on this call today in doing so. And as I mentioned, we're continuing to kind of work through and work with all of our municipal partners to really figure out the best way to implement some of these transit priority treatments. Next slide. But regardless, we're always going to have to confront trade-offs, and that's really just because every single person riding a bus has different needs and is making a different trip. Next slide. And we already know that the current network already embodies trade-offs. They're just kind of throughout the network, so we maybe don't think about them that way. Next slide. However, just to be clear, in terms of the trade-offs that we're not making, we are planning to maintain overall network coverage. So the places we serve today will still have service generally within walking distance. Next slide. But there are a range of trade-offs to consider. I won't talk through all of these, but there's things like route and stop spacing, deviation, simplicity, transfers, bus rail, relationship, express service, downtown focused and peak focus. And again, I have examples of these if folks want to dive into this, but just wanted to mention some of them here. Next slide. And then as well as just again, knowing that there's, every single person has a different need. And so you have to think about these trade-offs and how they impact different populations. Next slide. And so when you see a map next year, and I'll talk about that timeline in a bit, you will see how we've applied these trade-offs in different ways across the network, and we'll be asking you if we got that right. Next slide. So the system will change, but those changes will result in a much better bus system. So for most current riders, they should see a faster, more direct, more reliable service. For some non-riders, they will be able to better understand the system, and that will make it easier for them to become bus riders. For many transit critical populations, many of them should experience more frequent and convenient service. But this does mean that a lot of our current riders will need to adjust to change. Next slide. And so just to be clear, I wanted to emphasize we are planning for the future. So we are planning for a network that will be able to grow and expand with additional resources. And the analysis tools that we've developed through this process will allow us to adjust as the region continues to evolve. Next slide. Okay, so I wanted to just wrap up with kind of where we're going over the next 6 months, as there will be a lot coming up on this project very soon. Next slide. So over the next 6 months, starting in the winter of 2022, so just in a few months really, we will begin having pre-briefings with elected officials, municipalities, and other external stakeholders before we bring a draft network map to the public. So essentially sharing that with a lot of folks here. And then following that, we will conduct 2 months of extensive public outreach, including street team outreach. And we, just to be clear here, like we entirely expect the map to change as a result of the comments that we receive. And it will be a very intensive kind of 2 to 3 months where we will be doing outreach to receive all those comments. So once we've kind of cataloged all those comments and taken them into consideration, we will bring a final network map to our board in the summer of 2022 for approval based on all of those comments received. And then in the fall or winter, probably more likely winter of 2022, we will begin our phased implementation of a new network. Next slide. And so just to talk about that a little bit. So we are looking really at like 5 years of to see a full bus network implemented. That is like largely due because there are some places, I'll call out the Longwood medical area specifically, but there's many others where we know we really need to work through what the dedicated infrastructure looks like in some of those places to provide more frequent and reliable service in the way that we want to deliver that. And so that's why we're looking at a phased implementation, again, starting in 2022, but rolling out over 3 to 5 years. With kind of different route changes, probably by geography, and then also the associated kind of infrastructure changes as well. So I believe that's the end of my deck. Yep. So I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you, Caroline. Questions from the members? David Kozis.
Okay, thank you, Caroline, for the update. So all along we've been hearing, at least so far, that the system-wide proposal that we expect to see is based on the assumption of unchanged operating budget, right? No increase or no decrease, meaning I think that we'll see that some areas will see an initial proposal that shows a decrease overall in transit services, and other areas, I think I'm hearing, would expect to see a proposal initially that shows an increase overall in transit service to meet all the needs. But I'm just wondering now about the implications of the new infrastructure law that seems that we may be receiving new funding potentially for transit operations. And so I'm wondering how this sort of plays into the timeline of releasing the proposal. At the beginning of this meeting, David mentioned that we're not really ready to discuss what we think the implications would be of this new law, but I'm wondering, has this somehow affected the timeline? Has it pushed it back? Are you waiting to find out some more information before you create a system-wide proposal of operating, of how the buses would operate and the frequencies, et cetera? Thank you.
So Caroline, before you answer, let me just give a quick answer on infrastructure bill. Because the T is a large urban system, we don't expect the T will get any operating funds from the infrastructure bill. It will all be limited to capital. But Caroline, if you want to now answer questions about schedule, go ahead. Caroline, you have anything you want to say?
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't unmute myself there for a minute. Yeah, no, thank you for the question. Both Davids for both asking the question and helping to clarify some of the points there. So I would say 2 things to that. We are definitely planning, we are creating a plan that is resource neutral, but at the same time, we have kind of the tools and analysis ready that if we got additional dollars and if we found out more information about that over the coming months, we'd be able to say, okay, these are the places, and we're really talking about frequency here. So these are because we're maintaining coverage generally. So we'd be able to say these are the places where we'd want to dial up frequency if we got additional operating dollars. So that's something that we're already kind of ready to respond to if that comes up. And then to David's point on the capital side of things, I mean, we're working really closely with obviously the transit priority team and thinking through, and we've already, obviously, David, I know we had a few discussions and with some other folks too in the meeting today around some of the, kind of transit priority or other types of kind of capital investments that we can make to help provide this high frequency service that we want. So I think it's like there's two different kind of pieces to that. There's the operating and capital side, and on the operating, I would just say, we've really created these like analytical tools and kind of support so that we can respond and be ready if we do get additional operating dollars of where we'd want to dial up frequency. And then on the capital side, we continue to work with the capital planning team and the transit priority team to really figure out how we can work together to implement some of those transit priority treatments, but as well as other kind of like bus stop improvements around where we've identified, especially these high frequency corridors.
Other questions, David, or is that, you got your answer?
I got my answer, but so just to clarify one thing. So the expectation is that when we do receive the system-wide proposal, which I guess will be in the winter, sometime at the beginning of the year, right at the outset, included in that proposal, you expect we would also know at the same time, where and how you're thinking about dialing up the services when the opportunity might allow it.
Yeah, I don't want to say definitely the where necessarily, though we would certainly be prepared to talk about that. I think, and as things progress over the next month, I do think if we have more information over the next month, it would be fairly easy for us to update our public outreach materials with some of those places if we know for certain that we will have additional operating dollars. But I think, essentially what I'm saying is we have the tools to respond to that easily. I think when we talk to the public, we will at minimum have this kind of long range or like longer range high frequency map that will show significantly even more high frequency corridors than we will show to the public to say, this is, if we got additional dollars, like this is where we'd want to go in the future. So we should have, like I said, we have tools to respond to that, and we will be able to say, identify some of those places publicly. But, as things are changing, like we're also trying to be responsive to that.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Tom O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, question for Caroline. This seems to be focused primarily on inner core, on the inner core system, and obviously in the outer suburbs we have needs which I think are in a lot of cases different than what you would find in the inner core. We recently we're currently wrapping up a Route 1A corridor study that's identified some gaps in service and trying to address some of the needs we have out here. Do you plan on engaging with the communities out here as well and the stakeholders out here as well over the next few months?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're definitely planning for like pretty extensive, what we call like, I don't know, regional public meetings. Obviously with, doing more things online, like we are able to connect with people like all over the region a lot more easily than we would have before. But, we are planning to hold, I don't know, like 4 or 5 public meetings that will be open to the public. And we're always open to go and present at different stakeholder meetings too. So if there's like specific kind of committee meetings or things like that where it would be useful for us to present, like we're absolutely open to that. I will say, like, in terms of where we're focusing, we're really looking at, like I said, kind of understanding how travel in the region has changed. And so, yes, there is a lot of travel in the inner core, but we've also been able to identify just generally more broadly, like how people in the MBTA service area are where there's kind of the highest areas of travel in the MBTA service area overall.
Great. Yeah, we have a in Trick region, we have a sub-regional working group that works on a lot of this stuff that's working on the study. So we'd be happy to maybe have you out to one of those meetings or something at some point.
Yeah, that would be great. If I don't know if they send out my contact information, but I'd be happy to follow up with you directly, Tom.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Lynn Diggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Caroline, and also thanks to Melissa and Wes, who have always been accessible to the Right of Oversight Committee. And in the when you met with the advisory board, I had said that this will work. Buses will work better when the cars are not on the road or there are fewer cars on the road. And I understand, I appreciate how giving the buses priority will make them work better, but that may take a little while to happen. And so do you think there's any way that we can work with operations? I mean, I'm thinking Dave Carney in particular, so that when buses get bunched, we can unbunch them, because I got to tell you, nothing drives people crazier, I think, than seeing like 3 or 4 buses coming in a short term, and then them having to wait a long time. And now if we make these short segments, and one segment gets clogged up, and now they're having to wait a long time to connect. I think I just wanted to avoid in the early part of this rollout of the network redesign getting a bad reputation until we get more signal priority. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Len. And I was going to ask if we could unmute like Wes and Melissa. I think they're maybe muted. If Wes and Melissa, if either of you wanted to respond to that directly.
Sure, I can take a first stab. So Wes Edwards, Assistant General Manager of Service Development for the MBTA. So Len, no, it's a good point, and bus bunching is something that we're always trying to actively manage, and we've tried to give more tools to a lot of our operations staff so they can, in all honesty, see like where buses are in the field, so they know if they need to take a step in during regular operations, and tell bus operators to hold or go ahead and sort of try to space out buses better. But your point also about bus priority is one of those tools in the toolkit that really does help alleviate bus bunching. And that is one of those conversations that we need to have with cities and towns about ways that we can improve the way buses operate on the city streets to help alleviate some of that bunching. So there are operational steps we're taking, but there's also a conversation about what some of the different street and infrastructure design to help alleviate that could be as well.
All right, thank you.
I could also jump in. One of the other concepts that we're looking at is related to how the network sometimes creates bunching. This isn't necessarily the case if you have, a single route like the 77 through Arlington, but in some areas where you may have 2 infrequent routes on a corridor, and sometimes it's very difficult for us to keep those 2 routes coordinated relative to each other if they have different sort of cycle lengths. They have kind of a different, I'll call it a period associated with that. If they have different frequencies, it's very difficult for us to keep those 2 routes coordinated. So we're trying to think of, are there network changes where maybe instead of having 2 infrequent routes, can we kind of consolidate those resources to have one really high quality, high frequency route, because it's easier to keep one route well scheduled than it is to keep 2 routes coordinated. So that's another kind of tool in our toolkit that we're using as we evaluate our potential future network.
Thanks again. Appreciate it.
Daniel Amstutz.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Caroline, for the presentation again. I think the additional detail put into it. I'm just going to piggyback a little bit on what David Kozis was asking earlier and drill down a little bit. But I wanted to mention that I know ITDP had hosted a webinar a few weeks ago where they got presentations from 3 or 4 different communities around the world that had done bus network redesigns. I think Dallas and Miami and New Zealand, and I think one more, Christchurch in New Zealand. And one of the major takeaways from that for me was, I think at least 1 or 2 of them mentioned that sort of doing things revenue neutral is not such a great, it's really better to be able to add some funding to it to make those high frequency routes even better or more frequent, or make more frequent high frequency routes. So I hope you're able to see that, or you were at the meeting to hear some of that, and because I think it was extremely informative. But I guess what I wanted to ask is, do you talked a lot, you talked about, if some opportunities come up regarding additional funding, for what you be planning to do to identify like what things you might do sort of above and beyond. Are you planning to put some cost estimates on that when you come out with the network, and what could be done? And also, I'm sorry, I think I may have lost the other thing that was in my brain, but the cost estimates, I apologize. I forgot what I was going to say next. But if you want to speak to that first.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine, Daniel. And yes, I did actually get to go to that webinar and was able to watch. It was exciting to see other agencies who've been able to actually implement a redesign successfully and hear from lessons learned. So I thought it was very, very informative. Yeah, so we definitely will be putting together some cost estimates, estimates, high level of like, getting a better understanding, kind of what I was saying earlier to David's question of just like, what would it take to turn some of these medium frequency routes into high frequency routes, and even what would it take to take some of these low frequency routes to medium frequency routes? We're like actively just internally working through that ourselves now, of like trying to understand that overall. So I do think, as I said earlier, we would be, though that's probably something, I don't know, we would necessarily talk about, have those numbers in all of our public presentations, but we would certainly be kind of like ready with that information and prepared, again, should that opportunity arise where we do have additional dollars to work with through this project. So we're definitely like preparing ourselves to, again, understand kind of where we'd want to dial up frequency if we had the opportunity to do that, and what the cost associated with that would be if we had that opportunity, so that we are ready to respond to that should that come up.
Thank you. And I guess the follow-up question I meant to ask, what I'd forgotten a moment ago, was when we say, again, this opportunity potentially coming, like, where would that come from? Like, how would that occur? And is there some way that communities around the region can help with that in some way? Because it seems very nebulous, sort of the way that we talk about it, as like, well, this might happen, but how would that actually happen? So thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question, Daniel. I don't know, Wes or Melissa, if you want to say any, I'll say some stuff, but if Wes or Melissa want to add anything to this, I think, we are the transit agency, and there's always, and we actually just briefed our elected officials earlier this week too. But anytime there's opportunities to advocate for additional funding for transit, that is outside of my realm as where I sit. But that is always certainly helpful. I don't know, Melissa, I don't know if you wanted to say more. I saw you just come.
Yeah, if I could, we have a number of different constraints, and different constraints are solvable with different time horizons. So for example, we've been talking as part of bus network redesign about making an emphasis on all-day service and on weekend service and on midday and evening service, and trying to be something for, all the types of trips that people are making, and not just focusing on commute trips. What that means is, with dollars and, perhaps the ability to hire more people, we could do more with our existing fleet. Now, at the same time, we're also looking at, perhaps promoting more routes to be high frequency. And some of those things might require more peak buses. And to a certain degree, we can add a couple buses here or a couple buses there, but much larger increases might be things that require new garages. So, if we're talking about a small scale kind of fleet increase, that's potentially solvable in a certain time horizon of, buying buses and hiring operators. And then if it's a much larger increase, then we're looking at kind of garage expansion, and that's just a different time horizon. So these are all things that are solvable with time and resources, and just different time horizons for the types of changes that we're looking at, whether it's focusing on off-peak, in which case we can use our existing fleet with extra hiring and resources. So just trying to kind of say we have different tools available to us in our toolkits.
Melissa Tinticalis.
Thank you. I was just curious in terms of any of the planning, if how it might relate to kind of the land use, if there's any incentives or things kind of given thought to, if there's more density, more housing actually zoned for an area, could that kind of work to get kind of the redesign going, or do you have to just wait, see kind of what happens, or could we kind of link that as an incentive for it somehow?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I mentioned, a lot of this is based on looking at the location-based data that we have, which does track with current, like, land use patterns. And we know there's a lot of places just based on that are currently underserved or maybe don't even have service at all. And because this is like a short-term plan, that's where we're starting from. However, as I was talking about earlier, we are planning to put together this kind of, at least on the kind of where we'd want to add more high frequency in the longer term plan that kind of goes beyond 5 years. And we're actually working with MAPC and their kind of mass builds database as well to think through like how we can talk about that. Because again, it's not exactly that like 25-year like out planning process. It's somewhere in between. And so we're trying to think of a way where we can utilize some of the places where we know there is like future development kind of coming up beyond that 5-year planning horizon and more in that like kind of 10-year planning horizon to identify service. I definitely think that that's, to your point, Melissa, like an ongoing conversation with our municipal partners of how we can work with them to really, create transit friendly, denser like areas where bus service will thrive because there's more people and more housing. But that's kind of an ongoing discussion that we're having now and working with our partners to think through that a little bit more.
Did that answer your question, Melissa? I see your hand is still up. You good? Okay. I unfortunately have to leave. Melissa, I'm sorry, you have something else? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to add, because I think, some of this for at least, kind of some of the more suburban communities, when they are thinking of doing kind of retrofit suburbia and building density, if there's a better link to, understanding how the bus service would, there's some way to say this program exists and the redesign would happen if we rezone it. Just because we have a few rezoning proposals that'll come up in the next year or two. And a lot of question is around transit. And if we could say, hey, the redesign gives priority to newly zoned areas or something like that, would be helpful for communities out in the suburbs.
Thank you. So I unfortunately have to leave to go testify to the MassDOT board meeting. So Eric Barraza is going to take the chair. Consistent with normal procedures, we'll call on MPO members first, but I do see your hand, Steve Olenoff, and we will get to you. I'll go ahead and call on Jay Monty now and then leave it to Eric. Thanks, guys. Go ahead, Jay, and then Eric will take over.
Sorry. Next, I want to thanks Melissa and Wes for being here. I kind of want to follow up on Daniel's comment, and I think we touched a bit on this the other day when we all spoke too. Obviously there's a lot of complexity in this, and to the extent that I think folks are looking for answers and certainty, and Carolyn, you said last week that give us a little more time and we'll have some of that shortly. But obviously throughout this process there's going to be many decisions, a lot of complexity that has to be worked out, and I can see you're all working very hard together from a lot of different angles on this. But it kind of leads me to the question of, as we get to a point of implementation or a point of adopting a plan, how is that decision-making process going to happen? Who is making that decision ultimately as to what plan gets adopted, what routes get priority first, what trade-offs get made? Because I see that being a big risk in this. And also I think from a municipal perspective, where sometimes I think to us, it can feel like a lack of transparency if we can't really quite understand how those decisions are being made and who's making them.
Yeah, so I think there's a few things with that question, Jay. So I'm going to try to break it down, but let me know if I kind of missed anything. So I think first and foremost, like the decision making, we've tried to be transparent in talking about this data and the metrics that we're using to really inform the design. Like we are really starting from a place of prioritizing like transit critical populations in a way I don't think we have previously, to really make sure that the network is more equitable than the current network. And when I say that again, I'm talking about making it better largely for low income populations and people of color. And that means both in terms of getting people to the places they want to go, but also improving service. Because it's like, if you can get people there, but if it's not high frequency, kind of what's the point? So I think that's like the starting point for our decision making, right? It's not coming from like one person or one department. It's starting from this kind of better understanding how we can better serve these transit critical populations. And then of course, wanting to hear directly from riders if we did that, and if the map actually, you know, does what we're trying to do. So, and that's why we're planning for so much kind of extensive outreach in the early 2022. I'm saying that because it's still TBD on the exact month, but it will be early 2022. And part of that too is right, because we're having so much conversation with you all now too, and wanting to kind of have an opportunity to have some of these pre-briefings before we bring a map out to the public. As I've heard from many of you that it is very helpful to have some time for you to be able to digest it and then obviously bring it back to your kind of elected officials and folks that you work with. So we're trying to really, work with our municipal partners in a way that, I think we haven't exactly before in really shaping this and talking to you all early before we even have all of the details to say, these are some routes we're looking at now. Do these make sense? Do these make sense with the development you're thinking of? Do these make sense with all the other work that's going on right now? And so I think, that first and foremost, just want to say it's not like a, one person or a group of individuals making the decisions. We're really trying to start from this place of like data driven and people driven, both together. And then, after that, doing the people driven part, which is really doing extensive stakeholder engagement to hear from everyone and incorporate the comments we hear. Once we have a new network that incorporates those comments, then we bring it to our board and to our leadership to approve of it. But that network map that we bring should largely include a lot of the comments we're going to hear from all of you all. Of course, there are trade-offs, and of course we can't address every single comment, but we will have kind of a way that we kind of respond to all of those and be able to talk to those in more detail. And then as far as implementation goes, I think you raised a good question here on kind of what the rollout of that will look like. And I think what we really want to start with are some of the places where we know are like easier to implement, especially in the first year. Some places where it'll be easier to kind of just like upgrade some of the routes that already exist, but also like integrating that with some of the new route structures. So I think we're really looking for and actually to Len's kind of earlier point too, like we really want the first and second year of bus network redesign, and well, all of it especially, but really the first year to really show and emphasize the types of improvements that we want to make to the network to really exemplify that for people so that they understand what we mean when we say we're redesigning the bus network. So we're really trying to think now about where some of those places could be that would be more easily implementable. And that will absolutely require like a very strong partnership with all of you to really figure that out as well and figure out those details. But so I think, I hope I addressed all your questions, Jay, but let me know if I left anything out.
Yeah, and I think, to your credit, one of the things that's worked really well over the last few years has been some of the agreements that have been done for bus lanes. We've had these, MOUs and other funding agreements between the T and between municipalities that I think create a lot of accountability for both parties. And so I'd like to see something like that as part of this process, because I think we've got a process like this or a project like this that's so kind of vast and, you know, has so many components in so many different places. I think there's going to be a big part of this that really requires a lot of accountability for everybody involved. And I'm not pointing fingers at anybody, just, you know, we all want to get something done and we all need to, you know, work towards certain timelines and metrics and so on. So I hope that's something that, you know, we get the implementation that we can really beef up and continue. And again, to your credit, I mean, that's something you guys have done really well with the bus lanes lately. So I hope that'll continue.
Not my credit, but I'll take
Well,
it.
all of your credit, right?
Yeah, and actually to that point, at some point, I do plan to come back to the MPO to talk about when we really have that map, especially of the high frequency corridors, because I think there is a unique opportunity there for the MPO to play a larger role in like, and I know we were talking, the previous presentation was about the TIP and other funding. Like, I think there is an opportunity to really have the MPO play a larger role in like adopting the high frequency network and like almost kind of after we get it approved, potentially, you know, like having that integrated into all of the planning processes that the MPO does too. I think there's definitely more conversation I want to have with all the folks here to really think through your point, Jay, of like how we can more formally adopt this and work together. Because this is like absolutely a process that will not be successful if we don't have the partnerships. And so that's a really critical component here. And so we need to work with all of you and hear from all of you of like, what are the best mechanisms to formalize those partnerships so that we can implement this successfully.
And I would even, just one last thing, I would even encourage that to happen, you know, even prior to full adoption of the plan, because I think what a lot of us maybe want to see is that partnership firm up and know that we're going to support a plan that's going to be, you know, supported on both sides and be held accountable on both sides. So I really think about actually starting that process a little sooner than maybe, you know, you're suggesting.
Thanks. That's good feedback to have, and definitely a conversation that we should continue as we kind of have more details.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jay. Jim Fitzgerald.
Thank you, and thanks, Caroline, for talking with us today. Just kind of to get to one of some of the stuff that David and Jay and Daniel were getting at about, you know, the implications of the infrastructure bill and the ability to hopefully accelerate some of the bus accommodations within the network. Similarly, wanted to request that maybe we consider, you know, how, as we admittedly know that the bus garage capacity is a limiting factor on adding future service, if the infrastructure bill could help accelerate the timeline that Scott Hamway is managing on modernizing and improving the bus garages. And if, you know, that gets accelerated, is there also that opportunity to consider a future where there is additional service? You know, I know we're talking with Scott specifically about one of our facilities and increasing kind of the capacity there as part of that electrification and new facility of that new garage. So I just would like to request that kind of be a consideration as well. You know, if you're able to modernize all your garages faster as well as potentially increase their capacity, how could that, you know, talk about a longer term future that has, you know, additional service. So.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Jim. And actually, I should have mentioned too, in that kind of like longer term vision that we're thinking of putting together, which again, is not something that would be the detailed map, but more just if we had additional operating dollars, kind of where we'd want to dial up frequency. I think there's definitely a capital component to that as well, to think through kind of, in order to do this, what would the associated capital costs be, and working with our partners on that. And that's why I always start this presentation with like all the different initiatives going on at the T to improve the bus experience, because this process, similar to the municipal partnerships, like largely depends on all of those as well to really be successful and provide the service that we need. So I totally understand that comment and appreciate it, because we're definitely working really closely with the folks working to modernize our fleet and facilities and think about how we can integrate both of those planning processes together to really maximize the benefit of that.
Great, thank you, Jim. Steve Olenoff.
Yeah, I think it's important to make sure you're coordinating this with other studies going on. Tom O'Rourke mentioned one of them, the Route 1 and Route 1A studies through the corridor south of Boston. Another one is a UPWP study that's, I don't know when it's going to actually start, but it's set for this year for inner city people getting out to the Blue Hills Reservation, where there's currently no service. That's one that you should coordinate with. And also local shuttle bus services in various towns in the region, and proposed shuttle bus services. For example, Route 109, should there be a bus, the length of that from Dedham out to Milford, or would it be better served by individual shuttle bus services in each town along the way? And it would be helpful, really helpful for the T to say, okay, one's not feasible, but those shuttle bus services from town to town would be, and that would be very good for the advocates in each town who want to see that happen, to be able to say the T thinks this will work, and it be all a coordinated part of the overall system, even though they're individual towns doing these things.
Yeah, thanks for those comments. We definitely are trying to coordinate with other planning processes going on. That's the benefit of kind of running this out of MassDOT's Office of Transportation Planning, is that we're able to kind of work with my other colleagues who are working on a lot of those planning processes. And then to your other point about shuttle buses, we've actually begun some preliminary conversations with some of the TMAs and other shuttle bus kind of service providers to think through how our network can complement the services that they provide. And I expect that to be a conversation that continues once we actually better understand what the full network map looks like.
Thank you.
Tom Bent.
Thank you, Caroline. I agree with just about all the comments from my Intercore colleagues that brought up today, but also with what Steve had said. And one of the other things that we have, quite a bit, and whether it's Somerville, Cambridge, or whatever, is a lot of the different universities have shuttle services too now. Tufts has the one that brings students, from different places. And I think part, again, when doing coordination, is knowing what those bus routes are and where they're going, because if a route maybe gets modified or changed, you'd want to be talking to the university to say, hey, we're no longer going to be having, the 86 bucks go here now, So again, it's just more coordination with these private services and what we've seen is a lot of them have expanded, especially during this COVID time, shuttling students to different, locations and things like that. So just one more thing probably to put in the bag of what you have to kind of coordinate.
Yeah, thank you. Totally agree. I think, again, like once we have the full kind of network map, we'll be able to have more of those conversations so we can really understand where we can complement one another.
Thank you.
Great. So are there any other final questions for Caroline? Okay, I'm not seeing any. Caroline, thank you very much. This was great. Really appreciate all the work that you and Melissa and Wes and all the others at the MBTA and MassDOT are doing on this. This is really exciting and looking forward to more of the details. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. What is next on the agenda? Is it member items? Are there any members items? Not seeing any. What are we, is the last thing adjourn? I think it is. So can I have a motion to adjourn? Len Diggins.
Motion to adjourn, Mr. Chair.
And a second? Bill Conroy.
I second that.
Then without objection, we are adjourned. I hope everyone gets some opportunity to get outside and enjoy this beautiful day. Take care, everybody. Great meeting today.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Bye.